Hey there, art nerds. We are on our fifth from start to finish tutorial. Today, I'm going to walk you through my process for drawing, inking, and painting this super cute mushroom girl. I also have a printable line art for my patrons over on Patreon. You can join them and paint along with me at patreon.com/natosoup. All the materials that I used in this tutorial will be listed out in the description down below. I'm painting today with my Daily Driver watercolor palette, but you should be able to paint along with me for the most part if you're working with your own favorite watercolors or your own favorite mixing set. Grab your brushes, grab your paint, and let's get started. You guys probably remember the strawberry girl that we worked through last time. So we are flipping over to a fresh sheet of paper in our Canson XL watercolor sketchbook, and I am sketching very lightly with Pentel red lead. And basically at this point, I'm just kind of doing placement sketches, sketching in a stick figure of what I have in mind. I do have a thumbnail sketch for this illustration, both one that I did digitally and then a slightly better one that I did in my sketchbook, and I am referencing that off to the side, but it's still important to make sure I place everything first before I really commit to drawing it in. If you guys have ever made the mistake of trying to draw a person and their feet don't fit on the page or their head doesn't fit on the page, this kind of sketching method will help prevent that from happening. So once I have everything kind of placed in, I'm starting to sketch in more of the details. So we're sketching in the skirt and we're sketching in the hat, and I'm trying to keep it very light and loose because Pentel red lead is not the best at erasing. It will disappear for the most part when we watercolor on top of it, however. If you're interested in learning more about how to draw and paint people, I have an entire playlist for you guys that I'll try to remember to link for you guys down in the description below. I really hope you'll check it out. So at this point, I'm not really refining too many of the details. I'm mostly focusing on refining the figure as well as the pose, and I'm using what's known as constructive human anatomy. There are a lot of different methods for drawing people. This is the one that clicked for me, and this is the method that I happen to teach both online as well as in person. Once I have the figure blocked in, I can start figuring out how I want the clothes to look. So she's wearing a puff sleeve dress with a little vest, as well as boots and a straw hat. And I'm kind of blocking in the basic shapes of the clothing first before I start adding in the details. As with my watercolor, my sketching tends to start really loose, kind of figuring things out. And then as I figure things out, we start adding in more details. And that saves a whole lot of erasing and redrawing, That's going to save wear and tear on you, and it's also going to save wear and tear on your paper. Once I've got her pretty much sketched in, I start blocking in our mushrooms. And I will link what kind of mushrooms these are down in the description below. I've forgotten off of the top of my head. So I erased a lot of the guidelines and the underdrawing, and I used an eraser brush just to remove those eraser shavings. And now I'm going to go in and start tightening up the details now that we've got everything figured out. And I'm going to bear down a little bit more heavily with our red lead so that we get a darker version of our line art, and that'll make it easier for me to see and easier for you to see when I'm inking this. At this point, I have the concept pretty well figured out, so it's just all about tightening things up, cleaning things up, and adding in details. Generally, when I'm doing this kind of drawing, when I'm just starting out and I'm sketching, I like to hold the pencil very loosely in my hand. That helps prevent me from bearing down too hard and putting too much lead on the paper. It also saves on wear and tear on my hand, and it also helps keep the sketch loose and more flexible. I like drawing with mechanical pencils because I hate having to stop and sharpen my pencil continually to get that nice sharp point, and I am using a Muji mechanical pencil with 0.5 lead in it. I find that using plastic mechanical pencils is easier on my hand. It saves on wear and tear versus using resin or heavier metal drafting pencils. When I was younger and in art school, I swore by my metal drafting pencils. They made me feel like a real comic artist, but they did a lot of damage to my hand over the years. I think it's better now to work with a plastic pencil that either has a comfort grip or has some give to it, because I would much rather break the pencil than break my hand. It does kind of bum me out that people associate those expensive, fancy metal drafting pencils with being a real artist, because while I do think they have their place and I do still use them from time to time, they have done a lot of damage to my hand, and I would really not recommend them for daily drawing or daily sketching like we're doing today. That's just way too heavy duty for what we're looking to achieve here. I'm also using a fine mono eraser. It has a very small thin eraser in it, and it's great for erasing out smaller details or cleaning out the lines from among your line art. I have a variety of these kind of smaller specialty Japanese erasers that make sketching, drawing, and making comics a lot easier. Once I've finished my sketch and I've cleaned it up, I'm going to start inking with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. Those of you who hang out with me here on the channel have heard me talk about these a lot, but if you're new here, this is a waterproof and alcohol marker safe brush pen. I've also put a jelly grip on it to protect those arthritic hands. And I am working from areas of overlap and then working towards the background. So you guys see me working with this mushroom first. That's all the way in the foreground. And then I'm going to start working my way back, probably to her face. So generally, I work from areas of importance or overlap to areas that are less important or areas that are behind. So since her hat is overlapping her face, I'm going to start with her hat and kind of work my way down through the body. And inking is something that takes practice. I've done a lot of tutorials where I talk about inking and kind of explain my methodology. I happen to really like brush pens because basically a single brush pen covers the whole range of fine liner sizes for the most part. So you don't have to have like 6 different pens on your desk. You just need one. They do take some practice and they take some getting used to, and different brands are going to have different hardnesses and different properties. So you may want one that has a little bit of a harder brush, or you may want that one that has a little bit of a softer brush, just depending on how heavy-handed you are, how confident you are in your inking, how much practice you have, and what you're looking for in your brush pen. Typically, I like to use the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pens. Those are harder and smaller tip brush pens, as well as the Sakura Pigma FB brush pens. And I have found that if you bear down harder, you're going to get a heavier line weight, which is great for indicating weight, indicating how close something is to the viewer, or indicating shadow. And the lighter you hold it, the finer a point you're going to get, which is great for feathery, delicate things like hair, eyelashes, feathers, lighter weight fabrics, flowers, that sort of thing. So if you haven't given brush pens a try, the Sakura Pigma FB is a great one to kind of noodle around with. Not too expensive, waterproof, and alcohol marker safe. So if you like what you ink, you can paint or marker on top of it, and it utilizes archival ink. I don't have any kind of a relationship with Sakura. These are my own opinions. I use these brush pens all the time, and I'd love to point you guys in the direction of art supplies that you're going to like and that you're going to use. If you're working along with me or using this for inspiration, which I encourage you to do, if you do your own take on this prompt, I would love to see it. You can tag me on just about any service at NattoSoup. NattoSoup. I would love to see what you do with this idea. But if you were drawing along with me, just keep in mind this video, pretty much all of the portions of drawing, inking, painting, etc. have been sped up by about 4 times. So just be patient with yourself. Give yourself plenty of time. Basically, what I did is I did the sketch one evening, I did the inks another evening, and then I painted it over a couple of days. So Art takes time. Be patient with yourself and give your art the time that it deserves. We don't have to post to social media every single day. I know how tempting that is. I fall into that trap too. But I also find that it means I'm rushing things that could sometimes use a little bit more time to work on. If you would just like the color and you want to skip the drawing and inking stages, I've shared the line art for this over on my Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. Pretty much any of my inked art projects, I will share the line art over there if for anybody who wants to color along. So if you enjoy coloring, whether it's for relaxation or you want to put your own spin on this illustration, for just $2 a month, you get loads of coloring sheets as well as early access to videos, tutorials, and backer exclusive access to the materials that I create for the classes that I teach in person. So you can join me again at patreon.com/natosoup. It is their support that makes the reviews and tutorials possible. So thank you guys so much. You guys might also notice that I'm working with a sheet of copy paper under my hand. This is used as a blotter sheet. It can be any cheap paper that doesn't necessarily have anything already on it. Copy paper, loose leaf, things like that can be really helpful. And it serves two purposes. It prevents my hand from sitting in wet ink and then printing it elsewhere or smearing it on the paper. And it also prevents the oils that our hands naturally make from migrating to the paper and potentially creating a resist that we're only going to see when we start painting on it. So while it's not YouTube pretty, it covers up a lot of what we're doing and it can make it hard to see. It's an important part of the process that allows me to make better art, and it's one I would recommend you try if you're struggling with smearing your inks, or if you're struggling with there being areas where your paper doesn't want to take the marker and doesn't want to take the watercolor and you're not sure why. Try this little hack first and let me know if it works for you. After I finished inking this illustration, I allowed the ink to cure to the paper overnight. So about 12 hours, really minimum 10 minutes. I don't like to do it any less than an hour. And I pretty much always give it overnight. That allows my hand to rest, that allows my brain to rest, that allows me to come back to the illustration excited to work on it and not feeling all dogged out. So pacing yourself can be just as important as learning how to draw and learning how to paint. So this is my painting setup. We have our sketch. We have a small ceramic palette that you guys see there. It's actually a sauce dish. And I have a few watercolor rounds as well as some watercolor quills. And I'm going to start by mixing up kind of this yellowish gray color to start painting our mushrooms, painting the stem and the scales on the tops of the mushrooms. And I recommend that you work with the largest brush you're comfortable with painting with. When I teach watercolor classes, I see two main problems. People want to work way too thick with the paint. You guys can see how thin that mixture is. And people want to work with the teeny tiny brush to paint huge things. And I have seen other artists on the internet using teeny tiny brushes to paint beautiful things, but that tends to result, in my experience with my art, in scrubbier, muddier art. And I find that I can paint a lot quicker and a lot more confidently if I push myself to use larger brushes. Once that layer dried, I mixed a little bit more brown in so we can get some more color. And I did another layer starting to build up shadow. And you guys can see I am working with this huge convenience color palette because I am a comic artist and this is what I use. But a 12 color palette and some clever color mixing should be able to get you the color mixes or close to the color mixes that we're using today. I'm also using that same color on her dress because I want the cream color of her dress to match the cream areas on the mushrooms. Let that dry a little bit and going in for another layer. So I have talked pretty consistently, pretty frequently about cellulose paper versus cotton rag paper. For all of these start to finish illustrations, we are working in a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. This is just to encourage me to do more looser, less rendered, less finicky watercolor illustrations because the cellulose paper just can't take as much wet and wet, as many layers, as much working as a cotton rag paper can. But as you guys can see, it can still take a good amount of work if you're clever about how you're doing it. So we're starting with really thin washes of color first, and we're going to use that to build up the saturation. And although I have, a selection of rounds here, I'm going to do most of my work probably with one round. So you don't need to have a bunch of different watercolor brushes in order to start watercoloring. When you see artists using or having a bunch of different brushes available, it's probably because we've been painting for a while and probably because every time we go to the art supply store, we pick up a new brush to try. So don't feel like you have to start with this huge collection. So I continue to add sepia, maybe a little bit of Payne's gray to our mix to continue to make it grayer and to continue to just slightly build up that saturation so that we can paint those shadow layers. Something to keep in mind if you're painting in a cellulose watercolor sketchbook like this one is that cellulose paper handles water and pigments differently than a cotton rag paper. So you're probably not going to be able to do as many wet into wet washes as you might want to if you're used to a cotton rag paper. If you're only used to cellulose paper and you want to play around with wet into wet, I would recommend getting a small cotton rag watercolor sketchbook because cotton rag paper is going to hold on to that water and allow you to do those kind of beautiful wet into wet effects. But we're not really looking to do that here. We are mostly going to be doing layering, building up our color and our saturation through layers, and we're going to be doing glazing through really thin washes of watercolor. And these are some of the easiest watercolor techniques. If you use alcohol markers, this technique is very similar to using an alcohol marker, and the way the colors kind of layer and glaze and create secondary colors, very similar to alcohol markers. Now, in theory, they work very differently. Alcohol markers push the layers of color to the back of the paper, whereas watercolor, it builds up on top of the paper. But for practice, they handle very similarly. So I've added a little bit more Payne's gray to our wash. I'm still working pretty much with the same wash. I flipped the little sauce container over. This one had two large wells, so it's actually really handy for this kind of situation. And I have a really loose, really desaturated wash of Daniel Smith's Undersea Green. And this is a granulating color that has a lot of beautiful granulation in it. It splits out into like 4 different colors, and that's what I was looking for with this. So if you don't have that color and you wanted to mix up something kind of sort of similar, you could mix sap green, maybe some ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit of phthalo and some yellow ochre to get that kind of swampy granulation split that I'm looking to achieve here. And I'm starting out really light with this color just to kind of get a feel for how I want to handle it, how dark I want to go, how much contrast I want to add. So I have a really solid color palette in mind for this illustration. I had a really clear idea of what I was looking for, but I still want to kind of play around with the saturations and play around with the granulation so I can find that sweet spot. Once that first layer of undersea green dried, I'm going in with a second layer. And this might be an obvious watercolor tip, but when I'm working with a large wash like this on a paper that's very prone to drying out quickly, I like to work in sections rather than like starting at the top of the largest section and just hoping it doesn't dry towards the other end. Something else I'll do is if I have a larger section that I want to fill, I will pool the water at the side that I'm not ready for yet and let that sit and then come back to that. And that can help with streaking, but I will say, even being super careful and with things not drying out on me before I finished painting the area, it did dry a little bit streaky. That's just a property of cellulose paper. So don't beat yourself up too much over it. Keep in mind, we're working in a watercolor sketchbook and we're really just trying to make some cute art and make some sketches and keep things a little bit lighter and a little bit looser. I'm also adding a little bit of shadow to her hair. Using Payne's Gray just to show that the hat is casting a little bit of a shadow, kind of reminiscent of the mushroom caps on top of the mushroom stems. So now I'm mixing up her skin tone. I wanted to go very light and almost like a cream color for her skin tone, kind of reminiscent of our mushrooms. So I mixed a little bit of yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet lake, keeping it very, very light, and I am applying an initial all over wash to create kind of a base layer of the color of her skin. You could leave islands of white for highlights if you want to. Lots of artists do that, and that can be a good way to kind of compensate when you don't have a whole boatload of colors to work with, is utilizing the white of the paper. So once that all kind of dried, I'm using some masking fluid that I have in a small glass bottle that I got from Dollar Tree. I like to portion out my masking fluid like this for a couple of reasons. It's easier to work with like this, less prone to spilling, but also the whole bottle is less likely to spoil. And I find that these smaller bottles stay fresher longer too. So it's a win-win for me. And they're very cheap. You can get like 6 of them for $1.25. And I just clean out my bottle and reuse it over and over and over again. If you've done any of my art kits, then you've probably received a small bottle of masking fluid in it. I work the exact same way. I send you guys supplies. So I am also using a small synthetic brush that had some brush soap worked into it before I started applying the masking fluid, and that's going to help prevent the masking fluid from soaking up into the bristles of the brush and ruining the brush. So I actually did pull out a separate brush for that. And that's a great opportunity for your really cheap watercolor brushes. Don't use your natural hair or your mixed fiber brushes for masking fluid. Use the inexpensive synthetic ones. Once the masking fluid dried, I'm applying another layer of the same skin tone that I already mixed to her skin. I apologize that you guys can't actually see the palette that I'm working with. Sometimes it can be challenging to capture everything on camera at once. Let me know if you guys want a secondary camera for those color mixing, or if you've watched enough of my tutorials that you have a pretty good idea of how to handle the paints. What's more important to you guys? To see the colors that I grab or to see how I actually mix the paints themselves? So now I'm going to start with our mushrooms, and I'm starting with, I started with Chinese orange, and then I'm dabbing in Scarlet Lake wet into wet so that we get kind of a neat color transition. Chinese orange is it's a Sennelier color. It's kind of a beautiful pre-mixed orange. You could almost get the same thing traditionally mixing in orange with scarlet and with a warm yellow, and then adding a little bit of brown to it just to kind of neutralize it a little bit. But it's a color I use a lot, so I like having the convenience color of it. Now, I did mask out the scales on the top of the mushroom to facilitate this kind of looser wet into wet, so that we're not trying to paint around those scales. This is going to speed up the process quite a bit. While that's drying, I'm going to go in and do another layer of her skin tone. So in my sketchbooks, I like to kind of avoid doing too many shadows that aren't like local color shadows. I mostly focus on utilizing the saturation of the paint rather than adding in a shadow color. And part of the reason is because cellulose papers can make colors go a little bit more muddy. So it's really better to try and simplify things. And that can be really good too, because I tend to really overcomplicate things when I'm working on cotton rag, because the cotton rag kind of allows for me to do that. The cellulose paper doesn't. So it really kind of forces me to think a little bit more strategically and to kind of pare things down a little bit more. So I've started adding some of the red to her little straw hat, and I am using kind of a stippling motion to create the impression of straw. So I'm painting teeny tiny little like U or curve shaped brush strokes, and really trying to work on my brush strokes, vary my brush strokes, and rely on my brushes rather than just focusing on filling an area with color has made watercolor painting so much more fun for me. And I think it adds a lot of variety and interest into what I do. So that's an area that I'm really trying to be better about, is relying on the brush to do my texture and to add some interest and to have some interesting brush strokes. And that's an area I want to explore even further by adding additional brush shapes to my repertoire. But if you're just buying your watercolor brushes, if you're just kind of getting into it and you want to paint a lot of people, or you want to paint comics, like I paint watercolor comics, rounds are a great way to get started. They are good all-rounders. So I wanted to build up the color on our mushroom caps. I'm starting again with another layer of Chinese orange, some scarlet, and then a little bit of alizarin crimson at the cap, and just kind of letting it blend down. It's not going to blend perfectly. It's not going to be this perfect ombre, but we're working in a watercolor sketchbook, so we are not looking for perfection today. This is our opportunity to see just kind of what happens and to just kind of enjoy watercolor painting. I'm going to go in with our alizarin crimson and really trying to focus on the shaded areas, the scallops of her hat. I'm going to add some more of those little curve shaped brush strokes to continue the illusion that we're painting straw on her straw hat. I was kind of torn about what color I wanted to do her boots. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go with a darker red or with a brown. So I'm starting here with sepia and just kind of thinking about how I feel about it, because I haven't quite decided if I want to go with brown or with black for her hair. For her vest, I'm starting with alizarin crimson. This is going to be a cooler, darker kind of red, and it's going to give us kind of like Little Red Riding Hood or fantasy or cottagecore vibes, which is obviously all what I'm about here on the channel. I'm also going to use alizarin crimson to paint this is actually seam binding lace, and I did it as like an inset, so like you can see her legs through the lace. I just thought it would be a really cute detail and something really fun to paint. So I'm using alizarin crimson to do that, and basically I'm painting the flowers first. So those are like the little 5-petal things you guys see, and then I'm going to paint the fishnet. And the way you do that is you do a series of diagonal lines going one way and then a series of diagonal lines going the other way. You don't really have to paint a whole lot of detail at this scale, and that gives the illusion that you've created a netting. Similar effect can be used to paint chain link fences if that's something that you need to paint. Those come up in 7-inch Cara from time to time, so I've gotten pretty good at painting chain link fences as well. So I've decided to commit to the brown of the boots, and I'm doing another layer of our sepia. It's been mixed a lot more thickly. I know we can't see it, but at this point I probably have a ceramic plate, you know, the kind from Dollar Tree, over to my side, and I'm mostly just using that to pick up the paint and mix it with the water in the brush to get a more saturated mix. Those artists who can just pick up the paint straight from their palette and not mix it so that you get a homogeneous mix in your brush, y'all are impressive and y'all scare me, but that is not, we're painting very different things with very different intentions, so that just could not be me. So I decided to go with Payne's Gray for her eyes, lifted it out a little bit with a piece of clean paper towel, and I'm going to start with Payne's Gray for her hair because I think I've decided to go with a bluish black for this. Now, we could have gone more monochromatic and kept it brown or maybe even a brownish red, and that would have been very cute too. That's just a different way to go with this. If you struggle with color theory or coming up with color palettes, it's hard to go wrong by going with contrasting colors, like in this instance, green and red. They really make each other pop. And if you're doing it in kind of a pastoral or nature setting, it's less likely to look like Christmas. And then just kind of go with secondary colors from those two complementary colors. So for example, with the reds, we could go with oranges and browns. For the green, we could go with blue greens and yellow greens. And by simplifying your color palette like that, it's harder to make the wrong choices, so you're more likely to be successful. So we're finding success through simplification for this sort of thing. And recently I was teaching a watercolor class, and I was really surprised by how many people are just not familiar at all with color theory. And I did not really think color theory was my strong point. Color is not the thing people normally compliment about my art. I lean very heavily on keep it simple, you know, with like just complementary colors and then secondary colors branching out from that. That's my little hack. But there's all kinds of great resources online to help you with color theory. But really, putting yourself out there and practicing doing studies based on some simple color schemes will really help build that confidence. I also find looking at the color combos we see in nature is really helpful for color theory. So at this point, I decided I needed another layer of our undersea green in the background. Like looking at it now, I'm like, you know, girl, that contrast was good enough. Now you're kind of flattening out the contrast by doing another layer of this dark saturated color, but tell that to pass me. So I mixed more undersea green into our initial mix. It's also had a chance to kind of evaporate out because I've been painting this over an evening. I have my AC going, I have my fan going, things have evaporated. And we're going to get a little bit more granulation, and we are going to get more color, but it does start to flatten things out contrast wise. It probably would have been better if I'd left that green lighter so that the girl and the mushrooms popped a little bit more. See, the ability to rewatch and narrate on top of my videos gives me the ability to critique my own work. I'm also going to go in and add a little bit more to her skin tone because I really want to block in some of those shadows. I don't want to make her skin tone like a lot darker. I want her to appear kind of like pale, kind of like she's been shaded from the sun, kind of like some mushrooms are, you know, like a little creature that's grown up in a dark kind of secluded space kind of vibe. But I did want to add in some additional shadows because that's going to give us an idea of the form. And then once everything dried, I'm using my masking fluid Frisket, and I am picking up my masking fluid. Some people can use their fingers. I cannot. So that's like a little booger that, again, you can find them at Dollar Tree. Who knew? I've got like a whole bunch of cheap art supply videos and talking about studio supplies from like Dollar Tree, Five Below, Walmart, and online. So I will try to remember to link that video for you guys. I think you guys will find it really helpful. That will allow you to save your money for the really nice art supplies. I'm also kind of just touching things up here, so when we apply masking fluid, it can sometimes leave little islands where we might have wanted paint. So you do need to go back in and just kind of touch that up a little bit, like we're doing with the scales on her hat and on the mushrooms. And I am mixing up a little bit of burnt sienna because, like I said, I want more shadow, just a little bit more shadow on her skin tone to really help push the three-dimensionality of it to make it a little bit less flat. And burnt sienna can be such a wonderful color to have in your palette. It can be, if you water it down a lot, it's great for light skin tones. If you work with it fairly thickly, it's great for darker skin tones. It's just like a good flexible color to have in your palette, especially if you're only going to have a limited number of colors in your palette. Also adding a little bit of alizarin crimson blush to her cheeks and then washing it out with a little bit of clean water just to kind of blend it a little bit more to add a little bit more liveliness. Also adding some blush to her lips, the underside of her nose, underneath her chin, her elbows, her fingertips. It just kind of adds some vitality to the illustration. At this point, we are mostly done. I'm just kind of going in, cleaning things up, adding some additional shadows here and there, adding some blush, adding maybe additional layers of color. So this is kind of the point where it's like to your discretion, till you think it looks good, till you think it looks finished. I have heard the saying that art is never finished, it is abandoned. That's a popular art teacher saying. I don't necessarily... As a comic artist with deadlines, I don't necessarily agree with that wholeheartedly, but you do have to hit a point where you look at it and you feel, I call it the visual bounce, right? You feel like the contrast is there. You feel like the color is there. You feel like it's finished. And that can take time to develop. And that could also be a reason why some of us, looking at myself here, tend to overwork our pieces, is we're still fighting that mindset that art is never finished, it's only abandoned. You are the captain of the ship. You get to decide how much you want to work things, how much you want to add details. Like, for example, I decided that the Payne's Gray just wasn't cutting it for the hair, that I needed to do a layer of lamp black. Editing me kind of wishes I'd left it Payne's Gray. That was kind of an interesting touch. It kind of made it softer. But I decided, looking at this in person, that I needed some more darker values and I needed some more contrast to kind of make her pop. So once I'm mostly finished with the watercolor, I want to add some white accents, and I'm going to do that using white gouache. Yes, we could have done that with the white of the paper. That is true. Yes, old common watercolor knowledge says that you shouldn't use white gouache to add white highlights. You should leave the white of the paper. That is best practices. I understand that. But I am a watercolor comic artist and I do what I want. And to me, it doesn't matter what techniques you need to bring into something. We're not looking at watercolor purity. I mean, look, I've got like a manga inspired art style and I draw cartoony art, right? We're not looking at watercolor purity here. We're looking to make art that we enjoy making, that makes us happy. And we're going to do the processes that we need to utilize to make that art work for us. So if you want to pull out watercolor pencils, do it. If you want to pull out watercolor markers, do it. If you want to pull out watercolor crayons, do it. Whatever art supplies allow you to achieve the look, the feel, and the techniques that you want, those are going to be valid, and I'm here to co-sign on that. So we are just about finished with this adorable mushroom girl. If you want to paint along with me but not draw along with me, my patrons have a printable line art. You can join them at patreon.com/nattosoup. I had so much fun painting this with you guys, and I hope to have art prints, postcards, and maybe stickers of this little cutie available in the Natto shop soon. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Huge thanks again to my amazing patrons. If you guys enjoy these all-in-one start to finish soup to nuts tutorials, please reach out to me and let me know in the comments that you like it so that I'll make more of them for you guys. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again really soon. Bye, guys.